Clean Air Act passed the Senate unanimously and the House with 1 dissenting vote. NEPA, unanimous in the Senate, only 15 dissenting votes in the House. Clean Water Act, unanimous, 11, and then they overrode a veto. Nixon vetoed it. Gave away part of the story right there. Nixon actually proposed it and then decided it cost too much and vetoed it. Endangered Species Act, the one that everybody hates, passed the Senate unanimously. 4 dissenting votes. NIFMA passed the Senate unanimously. This is the only interesting one over here, the House 169 155. FLTMA, this is the statute that decided we would retain the public lands in public ownership and also ended homesteading. Homesteading lasted until 1976 in some part. So you can imagine Western congressmen having an issue with that. But still, the Senate with only 11 dissenting votes. RCRA, the same story. Circle, you don't have to love Canal, 9 senators for 7 voting, but it is an incredibly powerful statute. It is called the Superfund statute, but you should know the Superfund no longer exists. The 1995 Gingrich Congress got rid of the tax on petrochemical companies that funded the Superfund. But you can see that this is astonishing given what we know about Congress today. But it explains to you, to all of us, a bit about what they were thinking at the time. These were dramatic.
It just does that.
Does it? And it'll come back? Okay. These were dramatic, clear, and dramatic, clear, collective statements about what we wanted our world to look like. Now, I didn't ask you this when I had it up, but what do these, most of them have in common, and what is somewhat astonishing about, I'm going to emphasize the years here.
We have 1 decade.
Yeah, they're all about 1 decade.
Yeah.
Republicans?
Yes! Nixon, Ford, and Carter, right? The greatest environmental president in the history of the United States after Teddy Roosevelt was Richard Nixon. That's the thing I want you to take home from today. So, this has all been an enormous cost to the economy. It's destroyed American industry, right? That's the stories we hear. So the Clean Air Act is probably the most demanding of any of those statutes. 800 pages long. Tried teaching that in a couple of weeks to a bunch of new law students, or at that point, second, third year law students. Did it do any good? So the 1990 amendments required the EPA to engage in a study of the benefits of the Clean Air Act. They did 2. They did 1 from 1990 back to 1970, the benefits of that, the original statute. And then they were required to do benefits of just the 1990 amendments to see if it was worth anything. It cost, from 70 to 90, $500 billion. An enormous drain on our economy. And the benefits weren't that big, they only $22 trillion in benefits. And this is the middle range. Some of the estimates are over $100 trillion in benefits of the Clean Air Act. Primarily because of, well, we didn't kill people as much anymore. Asthma, lost work, all sorts of benefits from the Clean Air Act. And then the second study, just on this, a few minor amendments in 90 compared to the original, cost $65 billion in benefits of $2 trillion. Right, so these are not drains on our economy. In fact, they're incredible benefits to economic activity. Something that, as we'll see, we're forgetting. So that's why. And those are the things we remember, or forget to remember. Forget. These are the things we forget. The things that don't come up when we talk about these stories. So that's why it matters. Now the second question is, okay, Lauren mentioned this, how is it that these things are changing? And Congress has an act. Congress can do anything, right? Congress is not going to repeal the Clean Air Act. So how is it that the president can make significant changes in how we regulate the natural environment? Well, we're going to do a little bit of basic admin law here, administrative law here for just a second, and Lauren mentioned some of this, but just to make sure we're on the same page, we'll start where we should always start, with the Constitution. Okay? The president's duty, or the executive's duty, or powers and duties are established in Article 2, and this is the one that probably most of us have heard in Article 2, Section 3. The president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It's sort of the origin of what you learned and hopefully learned. Congress creates the laws, the executive enforces the laws, and the judiciary interprets the laws, sort of a basic understanding of how it works. with respect to the Congress, what the Supreme Court has said, this is a 2001 decision, unanimous Supreme Court decision actually, about a particular provision of the Clean Air Act. Congress had told the EPA, in this case, which is why it says agencies, but the EPA, right, is part of the executive branch, directed the EPA to create standards, in this case ozone, called National Ambient Air Quality Standards. That's the level of the pollutant that we want, the max level we want in the ambient air. So it's about the ozone standard. And the standard, or the guidance Congress gave to the EPA was establish the standard requisite to protect the public health. And the EPA's decision was challenged because that didn't provide enough guidance. It was delegating the legislative power from the Congress to the executive branch, which is not something the Congress can do. And what the Supreme Court said was, so long as there is an intelligible principle that the agency or the executive can use to act, that is sufficient. And requisite to protect the public health was an intelligible principle, and the court said 9-0, that's fine. So what that means, though, this faithfully executed and this concept of an intelligible principle, when Congress is enacting legislation and directing the executive to act, it creates, as you might imagine, a relatively broad field to play in. And so the executive has substantial amount of discretion to decide how the various statutes are implemented. So what I'm going to do now is give you an example from, I think I have two from the Clean Air Act, two sections of the Clean Air Act, one from the Clean Water Act, one from the ESA, Endangered Species Act, and one from the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. Give you an example of the sort of guidance Congress gives the President. And the reason I picked those is because I picked provisions that are relevant to the Clean Power Plan, the provision the significant provision for the Waters of the United States rule, and then the sage-grouse provisions, which we'll talk about later. So the Clean Air Act. This section is what gave rise to the regulation of carbon dioxide. So this is in the motor vehicle section of the Clean Air Act. Very similar to the what's called the stationary source. And it tells the EPA administrator that he or she must establish standards, these are pollution standards, for any pollutant, any air pollutant, which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health and welfare. So the EPA refused to do it. They were challenged. Famous Supreme Court case, Massachusetts v. EPA. The court said, yeah, in fact, you do have to go ahead and make this determination. It's called an endangerment finding. The EPA decides whether an air pollutant endangers public health or welfare. And as you can see, and this is the part I left out, which in his or her judgment cause or contribute to pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. But so you already have a pretty significant amount of discretion there. The EPA did decide that CO2 is a pollutant that endangers public health or welfare, which gave rise to a whole range of regulatory activities. But a similar provision, almost identical provision in the stationary source section, has not been used now for 4 decades. We only have eight what are called criteria pollutants. CO2 should be a criteria pollutant, but the administrator so far has chosen not to regulate the CO2 as a criteria pollutant. So once this has happened, we've decided CO2, and again, this is the motor vehicle rules. Power plants are not mobile sources. You've ever seen a coal-fired power plant? They don't go anywhere. They're stationary sources.